Okay. Yeah. Okay. Um, so let's just continue in this. One of the other provisos of subletting to another lessee without disclosure to the homeowner is that you cannot increase the density of the apartment. And this probably even has applications today, that even if you're the primary lessee, but there was an understanding between you and the homeowner that it was only going to be a certain number of people, you would not be allowed to add additional people into the unit unless you got permission. So we had seen a machlokas about this. He says, Ayin be'imrei Yaakov, shehuva pluktas harambam veharashba. There is a machlokas here between the Rambam and the Rashba. The das harashba deshari gam hecha shebnei bayis merubim. He says the Rashba is even more liberal, and he says that even if you wish to increase, even if the sublessee wants to increase the number of residents, he's permitted to do so without consulting the owner. Ubir bepluktasan usfurasam nira. So what's their machlokas? The harash besvirle de kevin de bebayis lo shayach havracha ubazelo nemar de ein hasocher rashai lahaskir ve'ein hashol rashai lahashil de zen nemar rak b'metaltalin. He says because according to the Rashba, the homeowner has lost complete control over his real estate, and therefore the only time that we say that a borrower or a renter has no rights is only for chattel. In Kain hasocher hashol shazachu v'nichne lahem zuchus ha'yishtamshus b'vayis lameshech shma hazman shekavu shuv yicholim lahaskir lahashal lachrim ve'in kan shum hagbala. He says, according to the Rashba, it's totally the property or the within the rights of the current lessee to do with the property as he wishes. There are no limitations on the covenant. He's considered to be like the owner of the property. But the Rambam says, no, it's a limited covenant, because the more it's clear that the more people who inhabit the property, the more likely that there's going to be damage to the property. In Kain hagam de bebayis lekach shash havracha ugeneva kamo b'metaltalin. And therefore, even though in a house you don't have the same concern that there's going to be any loss to the house or theft to the house, like there is with chattel, bikol makom shash kilkolika, but there is a concern of damage. And that would be the reason why the lessee has no right to sublet it to people, to a sublessee who wants to increase the number of inhabitants. Because there's every reason to be concerned that the owner will not want to take the added risk of adding additional residents or inhabitants to the apartment. Okay. I'm just going to, all right, so we're not going to do the next Bi'urim. It's a little bit lengthy and it doesn't really serve our purposes. But let me just see if there's any likutim that we haven't done yet, and then we'll move on to the next siv. Okay, so we started Sif Bays. Okay, and we're in the likutim and Sif Bays. Here we go. Lahaskiro la'acher. When it comes to real estate, you are allowed to lease it to a sublessee. V'im hasocher yatzam min habayis kodam hazman. If a tenant vacates the property before the term of his lease is over, it is permitted for the owner of the property to lease it to somebody else. The im hasocher, and there's perfectly valid reason for that, is that even though he's completely paid up, I guess there's an issue of midas dom zenenev zelo chaser. Like if you've vacated the property, you've basically withdrawn your rights to the property, unless you plan to return. But if you give notice to the landlord that you've decided you're cutting your time short, and you're moving, and the guy's already paid up. Obviously, a person doesn't have a right to sever a contract. If he signed a 1-year contract, he has to pay the full amount of the 12 months, or at least negotiate a settlement about how to exit that lease. But either way, even if the landlord collects full rent for the full 12 months, he still would have a right to lease it out to a third party if the current tenant vacates. V'im hasocher harishon, and let's talk about payment. He says, V'im hasocher harishon lo shilim lo adayin, as vaday tzarich lenakot lasocher harishon midmei sechirato, mashe mekabel me hasocher hasheni shedar tachtav. Now, if the landlord is successful in getting a new tenant, he's obligated to deduct the what is owed from the old tenant based on what he's getting from the new tenant. It's not halachically correct to double dip. Yes, it's true that you and I had a contract. You and I, the first tenant, had a contract that you were going to pay for a full 12 months. You decided to vacate after 7 months. You have 5 months of rent that is left unpaid. You're on the hook for that. But if I get another tenant, then I can deduct that. I deduct whatever I get from the new tenant to be able to. It's also possible that, it's also possible that there may be other expenses that I can still charge you for. So, for example, let's say in between each new tenant, I have to paint the apartment and I have to do a thorough cleaning, which costs me a couple grand, right? So I wasn't planning to do that more often than once a year, but because you vacated the premises, I have to do that with more frequency. There may be some way to prorate that to make you liable for that. Ulam im hasocher harishon kevar shilem labalabayis is kol has demei haschiros v'yatza kodem hazman. He says, but what happens if the tenant paid the full 12 months in advance and then decides to leave after 7 months? So now we have a bit of a gray area. Yesh omrim de'ein tzarich lahachzir lasocher es ma'osav, af im hasocher to'ein shimkein yamod habayis b'li diurin ein tzarich lishmo alav. He says there's one opinion, and who's he quoting here? He's quoting the Sma. He says, the tenant says, give me back 5 months. The owner says, I'm going to have a vacant apartment. You owe me, and you've already paid me that money. So we had a contract, you paid for 12 months. You're leaving after 7 months, but I don't have a new tenant. So the first tenant says, well, give me back, well, then I want to keep the apartment vacant. So the Sma says, no, he doesn't have a right to do that. The Yesh Cholkim al zeh, and this is from the Ktsos. Svir lahu de b'chol gavni tzarich lenakot lo. And the Ktsos says, no, you have to give him back his money for the 5 months. The kaven dehisker sabayis lasocher harishon lizman mesuyam. Arehu kanui loy lemeshech oso hazman v'habalei kos escharo b'parasu shel chavera. Because since he rented it out, and it's the first tenant's rights to own that property, so then what right do I have to do business with something that technically is your property? In other words, since you paid for all 12 months, you've become sort of like the owner, like we said before. A tenant becomes like the owner for that period of time of the property. And since you've become the owner of that property, I have no right to make money off of your property. So the machlokes is only if I'm able to find a new tenant. And it works basically like this. If I'm able to find a new tenant and you haven't paid me for the remaining 5 months because you paid me at the first of every month, and you leave after the first 7 months, and you haven't paid me for the additional 5 months. So if I find a tenant, great, then you're off the hook, and that's the correct halacha. But if you've already paid me for the full 12 months, then we have a machlokes if I find a new tenant. According to one opinion, I'm not obligated to give you your money back. And according to the Ktsos, that's the Sma. And according to the Ktsos, I do have to give you your money back, because otherwise, what right do I have to do business with a property that you've actually paid for and how technically is yours for that period of time? Okay, so that's an interesting machlokes. I guess the cautionary tale is don't pay your rent too far in advance, because otherwise you're going to get entangled in this machlokes. Now, as you know from a general principle, anytime that there's a machlokes among the poskim on monetary issues, whoever is in possession of the money can say, I paskin like the opinion that's in my favor. So in this kind of situation, the tenant decides he's going to take me to this is very practical, right? This is very practical halacha. The tenant decides he's going to take me to a din Torah because he paid for the full year. He left after 7 months, and I was able to find a new tenant to resume the lease, and he wants his money back. And so we go to Beis Din, and the guy argues to the Beis Din, and he's got a rabbi on his side, and the rabbi shows him the Sma in the Shulchan Aruch, and the Sma says, if he finds a new tenant, you have to give him back his money, because otherwise, what right do you have to enterprise? He shows him the Ktsos. What right do you have to enterprise off of this person's property? I mean, it's the tenant's. It belongs to the tenant for the amount of time that he paid for. So what right do you have to make money off of his rights? And so Beis Din says, oh, it's a good argument. And so the rabbi of the landlord says, but look at the Sma. The Sma says that I'm not obligated to listen to him. He says, I can find a new tenant because you've already paid for the period of time, but it's no skin off of your nose if I go ahead. It's zen nehenev zelo chaser. You've already lost your money. You've already paid for it, and therefore you forfeited it because we had a contract, and you can't go back on that contract. And the fact that I can enterprise off of your property without compromising the quality, because I'm going to maintain the value, right? It's different from making money off of my friend's cow, because there's always wear and tear. But in a house, that's not the same argument, and therefore you have this machlokes. So the Beis Din now basically is presented with two opposing opinions, and the Balabayas has a right to say, I paskin like the Sma. You can't force me to surrender money that was already given to me based on one opinion in halacha, as much as it may make sense to you, because there's an opposing opinion, which is, what probably the Beis Din would be forced to do. The Beis Din, in many instances, will try to make a peshara. What does the word peshara mean? A compromise. They'll try to make a compromise, and they'll say, listen, we see clearly here there's a machlokes. Let's try to resolve this in a friendly way. And they'll try and get the landlord to give back, let's say, a percentage, let's say half. Usually it would be half, unless he claims that there are additional expenses involved in getting a new tenant. Okay, but you should know that this is one of those issues where the benefit of coming to a shir like this is you find out the different opinions, so you know your rights. Okay, let's go on. Ruvain hiskir l'shimon.
Interesting, Rabbi, because just on that last point, though, I mean, usually I think tenancy is you pay first and last month's rent, even if you don't pay the whole thing in advance. So I guess he would lose the last month's rent because he's not there for the last month.
Or the tenant could say, "I'm leaving at the end of the month. Just use my last. When I first gave you the check, and I paid for first and last. Just use that."
Or you could say the 7th month is my last month.
Yeah. But if he leaves abruptly at the end of the 7th month without giving notice, so then it stands to reason that the landlord would not have to give him back the last. I think the reason why you collect first and last is because if the guy just ends up leaving abruptly in the middle of the night, you at least have 30 days where you can put things together and try to find a new tenant.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Ruvain hisker l'Shimon dira, b'cha'et lomeid Shimon im eza talmidim. Okay, Ruvain rents out his apartment to Shimon. And Shimon is using his apartment as a tutoring center where kids come to his apartment and they get tutored. Okay, the Toin Ruvain shelo hisker lo rak b'toras dira. He says, and Ruvain says, I rented you this apartment as a residence, not to do your business, where there's going to be a lot more foot traffic. Avalo b'toras cheder. Yesh omrim da socher chashiv muchzak umisfeika ein yochol limchos v'tzarech iyun. So some say that the socher is considered to have the rights, the full rights, unless it was stated explicitly otherwise in the contract. There are times where the rental contract will say the tenant agrees that he will not be operating a business out of the residence. But let's say there was no such contract. Everything was done on a handshake. So there is an opinion from the Sefer Dovev Mesharim. Let me see if I have it online. No, we don't have it. At least we don't have it with us. Maybe I can find it on my Otzar HaChachma when I get home. He says that the socher is considered to be a muchzak, meaning that he's in full possession and he retains full rights to do with the apartment whatever he wants once he's taken possession. And therefore, the owner does not have a right to protest if he turns it into a place of doing business. Now, we did see before that neighbors are allowed to protest, if you remember that, if you increase foot traffic. But does the landlord have a right to protest if the neighbors don't care because it's in the afternoon? That's no skin off of their nose. So it's not clear. But again, it certainly stands to reason that if the kids are coming into the apartment and it becomes a classroom and they become rowdy and they use the bathroom and there's more wear and tear on the apartment, it certainly stands to reason that the landlord would retain rights because he only rented it as a residence for a single guy or for a couple and not as a cheder. But it is interesting because today I was speaking to a cousin of mine who has an Airbnb business, and he was telling me that there are many ways that you can get someone evicted purely on the basis that they're operating a business from their apartment. But it's becoming increasingly more difficult to do that because now everyone can be running a business from their laptop computer. And it's not considered to be the division between home life and professional life is no longer what it used to be. That divide, like you would go home and you could put your business to bed when you come home. And today, and by the way, it's not only from a business or financial point of view, but there's a psychological toll as well. in the sense that the dividing line between where your personal life ends and your professional life begins, and vice versa, has become completely blurred. You know, it's like the life of a rabbi. Everyone's now living the life of a rabbi, right? In other words, the rabbi's on call 24/7, right? But basically everyone's on call 24/7 now, not only because of the phone, but because of Zoom and because of the laptop and everything like that. So this type of clause in a contract would probably not be enforceable unless it could be demonstrated. Where, let's say, where a landlord puts in, you may not operate a business, right? So he was telling me he was able to get someone evicted because of that clause, but it was very difficult. But in today's world, it's more difficult to uphold in court that clause simply because everyone is doing business out of their homes. Okay. Right. Here, right. Exactly. Exactly. So in a situation where you're increasing foot traffic and wear and tear on the residence itself, there it's much more clear that you can make this case in halacha. And so it's difficult to understand why anyone would say that this is permissible. And that's why Reb Stern ends off with B'tzarech Iyun, which means we need to examine this more carefully, because at face value it doesn't really make sense why the Sefer Dovev Mesharim permits the Rebbe to basically do with the apartment as he wishes and turn it into a cheder. Doesn't seem to make sense. Okay, let's go on. Hamaskir bayis lechavero chayiv hamaskir lahamid lesocher dilatot chalonot min ol v'chein kol kayotze bahem shehei ma'asei uman v'hikar gadol b'yeshivat habayit. When you rent out a residence to a tenant, you also have to provide him with doors, windows, a lock, and all of the other amenities that are standard expectations that a tenant will receive when he comes into an apartment. Like, you can't give him an apartment without a door, right? Or with one of the windows missing, right? Without one of the window panes is missing, right? And he has every right to expect that will all be repaired when he comes into the apartment. Tikein hamaschir dvarim elu v'nishbru toch yemei haschirus. But what if the guy gets an immaculate apartment, the doors, the windows, the lock, everything is working great, and something breaks during the time of tenancy? Im amar lei bayezeh ani maschir lecha. So it depends. If the term of the lease was, I'm giving you this house is yours, or this apartment is yours during the period of tenancy, ein tzarich lahamid lo bayis acher. He doesn't have to provide you with a new house. The kevin domer le bayizeh lo shibei nafshi el lahamid biyado b'shah sheyavo ladur sham umisham vahala azdele b'mazal dahasocher. He says, and therefore, whatever breakage happens over the course of time to the structure, the landlord is not liable for. Let's say a hurricane happens and it blows out the windows. You live in Florida. This is something that happens all the time. That's why you see those videos of people boarding up their windows. So, terrible hurricane, southern Florida, right? It's where everyone wants to go until there's a hurricane, and it blows out the windows, and I'm a tenant. And so I go to the landlord and I say, I can't live in this place anymore because there's no windows. The landlord, according to this opinion, has a right to say, listen, when we signed the contract, you took possession of the apartment and all of its amenities are yours, and they're your responsibility, even though it was an act of God that the windows got blown out, but that's your responsibility to replace. Aval im amar lo bayis stam tzarich letakno kol yemei haschirut. But if the term was this house as is, okay? But if you said not this house, but a house, and the windows get blown out of the house or the apartment, so then because you said a house or an apartment, if this apartment is no longer livable because the windows got blown out, so then the landlord would have to provide you with a replacement property, or at least replace the windows. So that's what the Ramah paskins. It all depends on the terms of the lease. And here, it could be just one word, zeh, the word zeh, which makes all the difference in what the responsibility of the landlord is. He says, but furthermore, that which we say, that if the term was, I'm giving you this house as is, and everything is working, and then something breaks, we say that the landlord would not be obligated to fix the broken window or so forth. That's only when the cost far exceeds the amount of rent that you're getting from the tenant. He says, when you, in a corresponding case where you said, I will give you a house, you would have to fix it. But if the expenditure is less than the monthly rent, I'm assuming he means monthly, so then the landlord will always have to make the fix to the property. So if the cost of which is it's a very bizarre kind of it's a very bizarre conclusion, which I think needs a little bit more analysis. But his conclusion is that if the expenditures do not exceed the monthly rent, then the landlord has an obligation, even if he only said this house as is. He would still have to fix the lock or the windows and stuff like that, because the tenant can argue the reason why you're taking rent from me is so that you can cover costs of breakage and so forth. Now, obviously, it would have to be proven by the tenant that there was no negligence involved, and that would be another discussion. Because here we're not really even describing what the cause of the damage was, which is surprising. So this is an ambiguous statement that he's made, which really needs further clarification.
I was thinking, oh, sorry.
Yeah,
I was just thinking the other way, that if it's something huge, like the roof caves in or something like that, you ask the tenant to fix the entire roof, but that costs more than, his whole rental and for the year. That doesn't make sense either.
Yeah, it doesn't make sense either. So